The third regional identity we're going to focus on is one of the most fascinating and most vivid because it's also one that arguably has the most long-term impact on the modern culture of the United States. So if you look at the map here, Greater Appalachia, the Appalachian identity is going to be the area not just in the red there, but if you think about it as well, into areas of upstate New York, areas like New Hampshire, Western Massachusetts. So Greater Appalachia is going to be a culture that's going to expand, come out of the mountains and expand with this group of people that are going to come from the Scotch-Irish borderland areas, and they're going to move into the backcountry and sort of define that area of the rural United States and the area before it in the colonial period. So as we look at Appalachia, the border ruffians and the rednecks, when we talk about rednecks, it's basically talking about the Scotch-Irish. The Scotch-Irish were looked down upon by both the New Englanders for obvious reasons because they weren't educated. They were terribly poor-mannered. They had a lot of cultural elements that Northerners despised, and so did Southerners. So traditional Southerners who were more aristocratic viewed the Appalachian people as crude and hedonistic, and there was nothing about them that was particularly admirable. So they were basically pushed into the frontier because both groups didn't want to see them around. Now, if you look at where these people come from, both from Ireland, but also the area from, if you look at the map, the Midland areas, the areas in the southern part of Scotland, northern part of England, and going all the way back to the Romans. The Romans couldn't deal with this group of that came out of the northern part of England. They said they were extremely warlike. They moved in clans. They had this kind of war whoop that scared even the Roman soldiers. And if you think about sort of how this plays out in European history, William Wallace, who was, if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, is fighting to basically maintain the independence and freedom for his people. The Scottish crown and the English crown used to go up to the Midlands to fight, and they basically the area that these people lived in was mountainous. It was extremely rugged, and this group of people, because they had no real trade to speak of, they were independent farmers. They were poor people, and they lived in family networks that had to rally together during times of warfare, because they basically were in the English area of where the wars were always taking place. So these were warlike peoples. So if you look at the Midlands and the upcountry, that area in the gray there, William Wallace was again this sort of prototypical Scotch-Irish guy. If you know the story of William Wallace, he's going to lead from below. He's going to gain his reputation by basically being in amongst his men and fighting, usually in armies that were tremendously outnumbered. He so terrified the Scottish nobility that they basically turn him into the British. He's tried for treason and disemboweled and hung and drawn and quartered and beheaded. I mean, just extraordinarily violent. So this was a culture that was defined by violence. It was defined even more than the South, a kind of brutality that was somewhat appreciated by the Scotch-Irish people. They thought that this was, again, signs of toughness. William Wallace is going to be celebrated by his people as somebody who was, fighting to preserve their freedom. So just as we saw New England freedom as being communally based, and the ability of the Southerners of freedom of wanting to be left alone so that you could rule over your people, this was a freedom to basically be left alone completely. And this is going to be very deep in the American way of looking at things. So this group of people, when they get to the western parts of the colonies in the early United States, they're going to be the ones that are going to fight against the government in the Whiskey Rebellion. They're going to be known as sort of the illiterate, playful, heavy drinking, swearing, provocative people. Again, the prototypical typical Trump supporter in the modern area was the Scotch-Irish person from years ago. So this culture was from even before they got to the United States, was known for kind of raising its children in a kind of a free range type of way. Children were called little shits. The families lived together in squalor and log cabins. There was just not much emphasis put on living an uplifting life. It was just more about just hard scrabble, doing what you have to do to get along. So the early prototype of the Appalachian cultural type, the William Wallace of Tennessee was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, as you know, from a very early age, was raised on the frontier. He came squarely out of Appalachian culture. When he was a young man, he refused to shine the boots of a British officer, and was cut with a sword, which was a sign of great pride for him. When he was a little boy, his friends gave him a shotgun, and as you know, if you've ever shot a shotgun, it knocks him over. He reloads the shotgun, he points at his friends, and he says, "If you ever do that again, I'll shoot you." So he was a guy who was known for making high-stakes bets on horse races. He gets into duels constantly. I think he's shot 3 or 4 times, each time in duels. He never really goes to school. He was a lawyer, but his idea of law school is picking up a law book here and there. He was known as a teenager for basically trashing local saloons. He and his friends would go and break glasses at the end of the night and basically have knife fights. So again, this is the kind of culture that we're talking about: heavy drinking, dueling, military service, and this is where Andrew Jackson defines himself as in the Tennessee militia. And when he leads in the Battle of New Orleans, for example, he's not going to lead like George Washington leads. He's not going to be on his horse. He's going to be right there with his people. And so this idea of extremely egalitarian, a sense of equality and everybody sort of working together. Now, this is going to be perhaps most clearly represented when you get to the Civil War. And of course, if you look at the St. Andrew's Cross Scottish flag, is going to be the model for the Confederate flag. And the Confederate flag, of course, it was the flag of the South, but the Confederate flag was really the flag of Appalachia, because it was the flag of not wanting government to come in and do anything, stay out of everything. And of course, it's also going to be associated with slavery. And most Appalachian people weren't wealthy enough to own slaves, but they believed that people should have the right to do this. And so again, while they themselves were a very equal society, they believed in the right to be unequal, if that makes sense. And so just like the Midlanders, who, when they used to fight, whether it was under William Wallace or whether it was the Celtic people under the Roman Empire, whenever the Roman armies would come up, they'd see these groups of people that were completely disorganized, and all of a sudden they'd be sometimes even drinking. And the Roman legions would come up with their organized armies, and all of a sudden this group of people would just almost magically, form lines and become extraordinarily organized and start fighting absolutely viciously. It's the same thing that happens in the Civil War, when the Union Army, which was highly trained and outnumbered the Confederate Army in almost every battle. But the Confederate Army had this ability to kind of organize itself kind of freakishly out of nowhere. And that's because these people were Appalachian. The Appalachian Army made up the core of that Confederate Army. And so that was their culture. They learned to fight from very, very young ages. So from the time they were children, things like no holds barred wrestling, which becomes the kind of the model for what will these days be seen as sort of the like the WWE, that sort of professional wrestling comes out of that tradition. And they're going to be playing with knives when they're young kids, playing with guns. The idea of gun ownership as a fundamental right is very much part of the Appalachian culture. So boxing also, that's a strong warrior ethic. So if you look at the Scotch-Irish, they are going to be extremely important in the U.S. Marine Corps. General MacArthur, for example, comes out of the Scotch-Irish tradition. So does General Patton in World War II. People who are going to see military service as part of being American. So this incredible patriotism, which comes out of the Appalachian culture, is also going to be in many ways viewed as a defense of their own family, their own clan, their own people. So even if you want to think about the people who were involved in the insurrection at the Capitol in January of 2021, these people, many of them out of that same tradition of fighting for your country, sometimes even in misguided and violent ways. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as president, as some of you may know, there was a completely unruly inauguration where people broke into the White House just to get alcohol. So alcohol is going to be another extremely important part of this. So the whole moonshine tradition, making your own alcohol, not allowing people to tax it, all that kind of thing. So if you look at border country and Appalachian presidents, starting with Andrew Jackson, we mentioned he's sort of the prototype of it. So was President Polk, who was known for his expansionism. And it's interesting that these Appalachians, they were the cowboys, they were the frontiersmen. And so in many ways, the Native Americans who saw this sort of front edge of the European settlement, they were terrified, just like the Romans were, of these people because of their penchant for violence, their seeming joy in hand-to-hand combat, and their willingness to do horrible things once people were injured. So a kind of brutality, which was part of this too. A lot of people don't think of Lincoln as an Appalachian president, but he was. And one of the reasons why he became president was he was an extremely good wrestler, very good with hand-to-hand combat, and he was extremely poor. He was raised in that sort of rural poverty, which was typical of Appalachian presidents. Teddy Roosevelt also had Appalachian elements to him. You think about Teddy Roosevelt's love of combat, physical toughness, those sorts of things. George W. Bush, right, who grew up in East Texas. So even though his dad, if you may remember, George H.W. Bush was a New Englander, he really wasn't. His speech patterns were much more kind of Appalachian. So unlike the South, which has a kind of drawl to it and a slowness, the Appalachian accent's a little bit more up in the nose. It's kind of more like this. It's kind of more of the twang of the lower Midwest. And this is much more, if you listen to George W. Bush, he has more of that kind of accent. Same thing with Bill Clinton. While Bill Clinton had the education, everything else, he had other aspects of his background which were more Appalachian. So if you look at all these things together, again, the importance of Appalachian culture on country western style, the use of blue jeans, the cowboys, pickup trucks, those sorts of things, very much Appalachian. As I mentioned before, country music and line dancing, along with rodeos, the whole idea of proving your physical toughness, whether it's bull riding or roping steers, those sorts of things. NASCAR also is going to be extremely important, which obviously it was originally souping up cars so you could evade the police authorities during that time of Prohibition. But again, the sexualization of women, that was another thing that was a big piece of Scotch-Irish culture. So professional wrestling as well. So if you put all these things together, you're going to see modern cultural patterns of much higher rates of violent crime in the Appalachian area, extreme patriotism, a lot of fundamentalist Christianity, and Christian nationalism, which we saw very much on display at the White House during the insurrection. And all this idea of celebrating independence, toughness, physicality, in a way that is very typical of a large portion of American culture. You can make strong arguments this is the core of American culture today in areas that are in the central part of the country. So consider this as you think about this third regional identity.